want to thank you for your promptness. Thank you yesterday for keeping to the schedule. Very much appreciate that. Are we ready to go?
Yes.
Are we ready to reform the monetary system?
Yes.
Well, our next presenter is a religious scholar. He's a presenter, he's the director of the Northwest Ohio American Friends Service Committee. He's on the National Steering Committee, Move to Amend, Campaign to Legalize Democracy Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy National Collective. He fully understands the need for rigorous research and study as the essential first step of any social change agent, and understanding the root of any problem and in developing appropriate organizing actions and campaigns. Without deep discovery of our core causes, appropriate social change cures are impossible. Please welcome Greg Coleridge.
Can I close this, or is that going to mess up? Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hope everyone is awake, refreshed, and dedicated to have a very good day today. And it is a good day. It's always a good day when one can rise up and be with friends who are working for common cause. And certainly our common cause here is to go deep in understanding much better this issue of monetary concerns and monetary reform. That's the deep part, but also going wide. And that is spreading the good news and the word about monetary reform to people who have not had the opportunity to hear our message. At these gatherings, as people may know or don't know, since I am height challenged, I always have to find opportunities to rise my stature a little bit, physical. Mental, it's hopeless. At least physical. And so toward that end, we're all to a certain extent living on the shoulders of Steve Zarlenga, but technically in the next half hour or so, I'm stepping on the shoulders of his greatest work. Give me a little time. So, little addendum to the bio that was given. I no longer am connected to the American Friends Service Committee after 34 years, which still is a Quaker-related organization. I now work full-time for an organization called Move to Amend that is seeking to amend the Constitution to declare that only human beings, not corporations, have inalienable constitutional rights. How's that for a radical concept? And that money is not constitutionally protected free speech. Rather, money is property, not speech. If money is speech, then those who have the most money have the most speech, and that's not a real good prescription or definition of anything remotely approaching democracy. So I'm going to bring some experiences from having worked with Move to Amend since its inception in Ohio as an organizer of the Move to Amend network over the past 7 years, as well as being connected for the past 2 decades with an outfit called the Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy, or POCLAD, which I think there's some similarities to where POCLAD was at one time and where AMI is now, as we try to collectively grapple with this question of what I was asked or drafted to speak about how to move monetary reform forward, and as a subtitle to that, money power and people power. I'm not having a PowerPoint by intention, because I think sometimes we can be somewhat lazy by having the visuals in front of us. I think what's required from this point forward is we think about how to evolve from where we are. And like anything in the natural world, and I say also, since we're part of the natural world, and the institutions we create are part of the natural world, a truism is, you either evolve or you die. And I think the question and challenge before us is figuring out how we evolve in ways that make sense, in ways that are consistent, that tap into our strengths, what we have, but also challenge us realistically in what skills, abilities, people we don't have, but that we need to acquire. And for that, I think it takes a great deal of imagination. So I'm asking people to, at least for the next half hour, to turn up your imagination dial even more. So, money, power, and people power. What's the consistent theme to that? It's power. What is power? Power is simply the ability to act, the capacity to act, the ability to influence. When we get up in the morning, we exert power, though I'm not exerting it quite as much as I'd like to, since I fell in the shower, twisted my knee, and am sort of limping around a bit. But nevertheless, we exert power in whatever we do, where we are at every moment. Same is so in our society. And some are exerting power way better and way more effectively than others. And so our challenge is to figure out and to understand what power is, who has it, what can we do to counter it, and where we need to go from here to possess greater power. Of course, the types that exist currently in our society are, and we can all spend some time, could we not, brainstorming. There's military power, police power, public power of all sorts, social power with people having certain social positions, and because of those positions being able to exert power, legal power, having control of the courts, cultural power. The media is certainly a tremendous example of being able to define the culture. Moral power, the good Rev and others who are able to exert power through their position and moral standing. Political power, in being able to shape public policy decisions. And then, of course, there's economic, financial, and money power. And don't we spend a lot of time talking about money power? But just to deconstruct that for a moment, if you will humor me to do that, we need to, I think, appropriately understand the full degree and magnitude of that which we call the money power of our society today. And by that, we're talking about, as the government defines and others, the FIRE industry. FIRE being short for finance, insurance, and real estate. People who sort of capture and try to gauge and quantify the power in society as measured by lobbying, by campaign contributions, or investments, take your pick. We'll use that category to describe that sector of our society that is exerting political and economic power. Of course, the FIRE industry, finance, insurance, and real estate, particularly the banking industry, we know, right? We spend most of our waking time, those of us working in monetary reform, on the economic power of the financial industry. When you've got the ability to create money out of thin air, friends, that is power. Incredible power. The likes of which basically nobody else can do legally, anyway. But that's not the only type of power exerted by the financial industry. They take that economic power, that ever exerting and ever growing economic power, and translate it into political power. And that's sort of been the characteristic of corporations since day one. When they acquired power, never intended constitutional rights, they tried to exert and translate that and morph that economic power into political power and legal power and constitutional power more and more. So what are some of those examples and illustrations of political power that the financial industry is exerting more effectively, more widely, more insidiously, and more a threat to the body politic than ever before. Well, a couple. If you just look at just flat out political campaign contributions or investments, because of course these entities don't just give to give, they give because they expect something in return. And of course, it doesn't take a PhD in accounting to understand that when you choose to invest, you are hoping to get at least, if not more, back than what you put in. And so it is with the financial, well, with all corporate entities, as well as the super duper well-to-do individuals, with the exception of the aunts and the uncles and the like of candidates running who give because they can give, but for the most part. So the fire industry, according to OpenSecrets.org, is number one. You have all the sectors in 2015 and 2016 who have weighed in and invested in the political process, to political candidates. And in fact, they are number one by a long shot when you factor in, again, finance, insurance, and real estate. Having in 2015 and 2016 election cycle, having contributed or invested $1.1 billion. And that's just direct to political campaign. You know, the legal laws say you cannot contribute directly to candidates or campaigns. You do it through political action committees and other sort of more indirect ways. But that's the amount of money they put into the political process. And they're first by a long shot. And they cover all bases. The past couple of cycles, they've been favoring more Republicans than Democrats, particularly 2015-16. But it's 60-40, you know, 55-45. They make sure that whoever wins, they've got covered. Lobbying, which of course is another way to exert power, to provide quote-unquote education to candidates and public office holders. Number one is held by the pharmaceutical industry and health products, because of course they have been, and they're always sort of up there. But in the 2015-2016 cycle, they were number one. But when you add in insurance, banking, and real estate together, it's very competitive. Banking is $33 million that they put in, again in 2015. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's just this year, 2017 to date, and we're only less than 3/4 of the way through. Money power rules. Money power just doesn't kind of have an economic influence in determining interest rates, and you know, when we're talking about banking and insurance, you know, monetary issues, they have the ability to influence public policy. When you have the ability to influence public policy, you are ruling. You are influencing. You are, so to speak, governing. And that's the reality of the money power. And they are governing in ways that have never, ever existed before in terms of breadth and depth. And that's just in this country. And you may think, well, following the 2008-2009 period, when they lost some of their street cred and some of their economic fortunes, that political power would wane. And it did temporarily through this thing called Dodd-Frank. But if you really boil that down and deconstruct it, the basic elements of what they're able to do was not affected much. And of course, there's a huge gap between any law that is passed and what, in the end, gets written, as our friend Jim knows. There's all sorts of steps in between that the lobbyists and that the campaign contributors can give to make sure that those who actually write the implementing legislation, even if a bill that is originally introduced gets passed, but of course that never happens, that gets watered down. But even if whatever is watered down is passed, there are many opportunities to water down and to create toothless regulations by those steps in between that are outside the purview of the public. We don't show up to our candidate offices or to our political elected officials' offices in that stage of the process. So many opportunities to water that down as well. How many banksters of the largest companies went to jail because of what occurred? Last time I checked, a big fat 0. And of course the bailout that started out originally as a whopping 2 pages in length, remember that? $787 billion. Legislation was 2 pages. Of course that got beat back temporarily though, when people showed up. And my congressperson, she was receiving 100 to 1 was the ratio of calls against the bank bailout to the pro. 100 to 1. So that got pulled, if you recall, remember? That got pulled temporarily. Within a week, the next thing came back. It went from 2 pages to, I don't know, 6 or 7, something like that. Pretty much the same amount of money, pretty much the same purposes, bailing out Wall Street, never mind Main Street, and even never mind less so the side streets and the back streets. So that's what we have. Tremendous examples of exertion of money power. How do we move monetary reform forward? Well, we must counter money power with really the only kind of power we've got. Us. Acting collectively together. People power. It's what those who've come before us, whose shoulders to a great extent we are standing on, who were part of the American Revolution, those who fought against sovereignty by a king to put sovereignty to themselves, though they got an awful lot wrong when they created this thing we call the Constitution. Many think first 3 words, we the people, were great, and it went pretty much all downhill for them, with the exception of a few things. But then those who followed, who were not in the original Constitution, but who organized to drive themselves into the Constitution, women, people of color, indigenous people, they weren't even 3/5 people, they were beasts, they were 0. They were, in some cases, animals. They're still fighting for their rights. And we still have people, groups of people, constituencies, that don't have authentic and alienable rights in all of their forms. Never mind economic rights that many other countries have. We're just talking about basic human rights. So what do we do? What is it going to take to build a social movement? And in particular, looking at AMI. What does AMI need to do to become more effective in trying to build a movement toward monetary reform? Jason, would you mind? I said I didn't have any visuals, with one exception.
Hold on.
Ingenious, isn't it? Ingenious. The single most important step, I believe, that AMI needs to take isn't kind of structural, so to speak. All of that will follow. Isn't financial, isn't raising the money, isn't figuring out who's going to be on the board. I mean, all of those are important, but it begins, the anchor, I believe, respectfully, with shifting our identity. We know how important identity is, right? Just in general. When other people are telling you you are a certain way, you are a certain kind of thing, and you can't define your own identity, that's pretty fundamentally disempowering. Figuring out who you are is a stepping stone, and so critical in moving ahead. It determines how you move ahead, based on how you see yourself. And I think, rightly, up to this point, AMI has been about Mr. and me. We've largely focused on monetary research and monetary education. and those have been appropriate. It is time that we shift, I believe, to monetary organizing. So we go from Mr., which is sexist, and me, which is egocentric, to Mo. Now, Mo isn't as Larry Curly, nor is it eeny, meeny, miny, which is happenstance. By Mo, we're talking about conscious, deliberate, strategic organizing. Now, to be consciously, strategically focused on organizing includes doing education and doing research. You see, doing research in of itself doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. One can just do research just to do research. And one can do education just to do education. Now, that's not always been what AMI has done. It's not largely been what AMI has done. But the chances of organizing and building power and building a base to move and try to influence with others the culture and the institutions is going to take some intentionality. And beginning from the lens of organizing means that the education and the research is more focused and directed, is contextualized on the organizing. When you start from the organizing lens, the natural question is, well, who the heck are we trying to organize? Let's get real. Let's get specific. Let's get detailed. What are the groups? What are the constituencies? And when you ask those beginning questions, then that leads you to the answers of, well, based on, is it conservatives that Mark said yesterday? Is it people of color? Is it labor? Is it people of faith? Whoever that group is, that subset is, and it can't be everybody. Let's organize the public. You can't. We're not in position like that. So you got a target to begin with over the next 3 years or 5 years. And based on that question of who you're trying to organize, who's got people, who's got the capacity, who's got resources they can bring to bear, then the question when it comes to education and research is, well, what's going to be the appropriate resources, research, and what's the appropriate education that needs to be done? What's the materials, the educational materials that are going to speak to those groups? So we don't determine research or education based on what we feel individually in a vacuum is important. We start looking through the lens of the groups we're trying to identify. If not interviewing them, finding out what they're most interested in, and start from there. That's what basic organizing is. With community organizing, where did that start? Right here, in Chicago. Sort of the Vatican City of community organizing in this country is the city of Chicago. I mean, that's organizing 101, basically. So that is what I believe, most importantly, needs to happen. I'll just give very briefly an anecdote about this organization called Oakland. I was a part of it. A group of frustrated activists who just felt we weren't getting far enough, fast enough, working on our respective single issues. Consumer, labor, peace, justice, environment. And so these frustrated activists came together and said, we need to figure out what the hell's going on. And what the hell was going on was that we were being ruled by corporations that had acquired these never intended constitutional rights to govern, to rule. And so POCLAD initially was set up with this goal in mind, and I quote, to instigate democratic conversations which contest the authority of corporations to govern. To instigate democratic conversations which contest the authority of corporations to govern. And that's what we did for the first maybe decade or so. Instigate democratic conversation, talking to people one-on-one, developing materials, doing workshops. I mean, that's how I got booked, going through a weekend workshop. One of these aha experiences similar to reading The Lost Science of Money, another aha experience. But they realized, Oakland did, at a certain point that we aren't building power quick enough, fast enough, deep enough, wide enough. And so they added basically 2 words to their mission statement: to instigate democratic conversations and actions, which contest the authority of corporations to govern, and actions. We began organizing, planting seeds, trying to identify groups, and all of that was sort of happening, not quickly, but then the Citizens United decision happened, and many of us who were involved in Oakland got involved in Move to Amend, and that became the expression. I see AMI as sort of where Oakland was in that period when Oakland was exclusively focusing on instigating democratic conversations. But at some point, they began to say, we need to evolve. If we don't, we're going to die. And they did, by focusing on saying we need actions, focusing on actions. And so respectfully, I believe that's where AMI needs to do it now. By beginning through the lens of becoming a monetary organizing, monetary reform organization, that again, by starting from that, then when you start looking at all the things that we're talking about and have looked at so far this weekend, and will continue to do so, the answers, I think, will be slightly different, maybe the same. But looking at it through that lens, when we think about what kind of internal structure do we need, what sort of external organization do we have to have, what do we need to do, what's going to be our strategic plan in the educational materials, in the communication mediums, maybe the ways and forms we communicate have to be consistent with what the people we're trying to communicate. If it's with young people, what are the mediums of communication that those constituencies are familiar with? All of these questions are predicated on who it is we're trying to reach. And that's predicated on who are those people and what are those organizations that individually and collectively can help us build power. And that is true not just as we think about ourselves, and that is true not just when we think about allies who are working for either monetary reform or issues that we think are natural connectors, like groups working for infrastructure, or groups working on some of the things we ran into at the Democracy Convention. But it also is true with every single group out there in civil society that is working for democracy. Because we're not going to get anywhere, I don't believe, on any of the issues that we care about alone. I'm sorry. Whether it's the healthcare movement that thinks, oh, that's the most important, and I've been doing what I've been doing for 35 years. Not that that makes me an expert, but in doing the work, being involved in so many different issue areas, you go to these groups, healthcare people think healthcare issue is the most important issue of all. Education reform people, damn, the corporatization of private education is the most important issue of all. And so on, and so on, and so on. It ain't going to happen unless we come together and we see that whatever our number one issue is, promoting real, authentic democracy, is that which is horizontal. All of these other issues, to a certain extent, are vertical. Promoting democracy and a democracy movement is horizontal. And so part of our quest in thinking about, and I will end here, of what we're trying to do is to build with others a democracy movement that will further all of the individual efforts and all of the issues that we care about. Toward that end, in response to Jamie's quest of, what am I going to do here over the next period of time? Well, I hope to continue doing what little I can to promote these calendars I put out, a monetary history calendar, as well as a democracy history calendar that I spent a number of months researching and doing. Second, support efforts to shift AMI to become more focused on organizing, which includes research and education. And third, as outreach coordinator, as I am now nationally, to move to amend, I am running into all sorts of organizations. And to the extent I can, to plant the seed of monetary reform to show that it is a piece of, and it is connected to some of their issues, just as some of their issues are connected, I think, to AMI. And all of these issues, I believe, are connected to the issue and to the quest, ultimately, of building what will have to be a wide and deep, maybe for the very first time, true democracy movement in this country, which we have never, ever had. And wouldn't that be refreshing? Thank you.
Stephen used to refer to some of his accomplishments as miracles. And one of the things he did was bring outstanding people like this to this conference. Thank you, Greg. Our next presenter is Associate Professor at the Department of Education and Administration and Foundations, Illinois State University. She came to a critique of modern money through her '98 dissertation on value in economics, ethics, and education. Her first publication on the topic was entitled The Inefficiency of the Cult of Efficiency, Implications for Public Schooling and Education. She has attended and presented this conference. She brings a broad experience and understanding to her presentations. Please welcome Dr. Lucille Beckley.